More men are walking away not from love, but from the game itself. Not because they hate women, but because something feels fundamentally broken. Tonight, we're uncovering the psychological truth behind what men are waking up to, and why ignoring it may cost everyone. Men weren't naive, they were instructed. From a young age, a clear psychological contract was implied: become competent, become stable, become dependable, and in return, connection would follow. Love would be built on effort. Respect would grow from responsibility. Attraction would deepen with consistency. That expectation didn't come from fantasy. It came from culture, family narratives, movies, social reinforcement, and even education. Men internalized the belief that value was earned over time, that patience would be rewarded, and that becoming better would naturally lead to partnership. But reality arrived differently. What many men are waking up to is not that the goal disappeared, but that the criteria silently changed. Effort is no longer interpreted the way it once was. Stability no longer signals desirability the way it used to. And consistency, instead of being reassuring, is often perceived as predictable. This creates a psychological fracture, because men are still operating under an older framework, one where delayed gratification mattered, while the modern dating environment operates on immediacy, instant chemistry, instant excitement, instant validation. The gap between these two systems is where confusion lies. Men are realizing that they are investing in outcomes that no longer align with the current reward structure. The traits they spent years cultivating, discipline, restraint, emotional control, are not necessarily the traits being selected for in the early stages of modern relationships. This isn't a moral failure, it's an environmental mismatch. Biologically, men are wired to pursue, protect, and provide meaning through contribution. Psychologically, they're motivated by progress and earned outcomes. But modern relational dynamics often prioritize emotional spikes over long-term signaling, feeling over foundation, excitement over reliability. So when men notice that excitement often outweighs effort, something destabilizes internally. They begin questioning not women, but the map they were given. Because the promise was never that relationships would be easy. The promise was that they would be fairly calibrated, that if you did the internal work, built character, delayed gratification, and showed up consistently, the system would recognize it. Instead, many men encounter ambiguity. Signals change daily. Interest fluctuates without explanation. Standards appear flexible for some and rigid for others. And the rules are rarely articulated, only enforced after the fact. This creates cognitive dissonance. Men start asking questions they never expected to ask. Why does self-improvement feel invisible? Why does emotional availability sometimes reduce attraction instead of increasing it? Why does stability feel like a disadvantage in early connection? These questions don't come from entitlement. They come from violated expectations. Expectation is powerful because it shapes effort. When effort no longer correlates with outcome, motivation collapses. Not explosively, but quietly. And this is where the awakening begins. Men start recalibrating, not outwardly, but internally. They pull back emotionally. They observe more. They invest less prematurely. They become cautious not because they fear rejection, but because they're trying to understand a system that no longer behaves predictably. The most alarming part is not frustration, it's disengagement. When men stop believing that their best traits will be valued, they stop leading with them. They compartmentalize, they optimize for self rather than union. They reduce emotional risk not as punishment but as adaptation. This expectation versus reality gap doesn't turn men bitter. It turns them analytical. They begin to realize that modern dynamics often reward visibility over depth, confidence over competence, and novelty over continuity. And once that realization sets in, the old instructions lose authority. What men are waking up to is not that love is impossible, but that the pathway they were taught no longer matches the terrain they're walking on. Men are beginning to understand that attraction no longer forms in a vacuum. It forms inside a marketplace where attention is the primary currency and visibility determines perceived value. This realization doesn't come from theory, it comes from experience. Modern women exist in an environment where feedback is constant. Notifications arrive without effort. Interest appears without initiation. Validation flows whether commitment exists or not. Over time, the psyche adapts to this abundance not consciously but neurologically. Dopamine doesn't care about meaning, it responds to novelty. Each message, each like, each glance of interest becomes a micro-reward. And when rewards are frequent and unpredictable, the brain learns to crave them. Not because someone is insecure, but because that's how conditioning works. Men are waking up to the fact that they are often entering connections where they are not the sole source of emotional reinforcement. They're one signal among many, one stimulus in a sea of stimuli. And this dramatically alters bonding dynamics. In environments of scarcity, attachment deepens. In environments of abundance, attachment becomes optional. This is where the validation loop forms. Attention creates dopamine. Dopamine reinforces behavior. Reinforced behavior seeks more attention. And the cycle sustains itself without malicious intent. No one has to choose it. It simply becomes the default. Men notice this when consistency fails to anchor connection, when exclusivity feels delayed or undefined, when emotional investment doesn't translate into emotional priority, The confusion isn't about desire, it's about proportion. Men are investing linearly, time, focus, effort, while attention is being distributed exponentially. The imbalance creates instability, and slowly men begin to recognize that attraction in the modern landscape often responds less to depth and more to stimulation, less to presence and more to performance, less to character and more to how someone feels in the moment. This changes how women select, but it also changes how men are evaluated. Men realize they're not competing with a better man. They're competing with the experience of being entertained, the illusion of endless options, the emotional buzz of constant engagement. And the psyche doesn't bond deeply when it believes something better is always accessible. This doesn't mean women don't want connection. It means connection is being interrupted by noise. Noise fractures attention. Fragmented attention fractures intimacy. Men begin to see that modern dating is not about building something, it's about sustaining interest in a distracted environment. And sustaining interest requires novelty, not continuity. This realization hits hard for men who value progression, because progression assumes stability, it assumes patience, it assumes delayed reward. But the attention economy rewards immediacy. What feels good now often outweighs what lasts longer, and when validation is abundant, it becomes less meaningful. Compliments lose weight. Interest loses gravity. Even affection can feel replaceable. Men internalize this not as rejection, but as impermanence. They sense that they are not being chosen as much as they are being sampled. And being sampled doesn't build security, it builds uncertainty. Over time, this conditions men as well. They stop over-investing. They reduce vulnerability. They maintain emotional distance not out of coldness, but out of calibration. They learn that giving too much attention in an attention-saturated world doesn't increase attraction, it often diminishes it. And this is where something subtle but profound happens. Men begin shifting from seeking connection to managing exposure, from offering depth to preserving leverage, from authenticity to strategy. Not because they want to play games, but because the environment rewards those who adapt. The validation loop doesn't create villains, it creates participants. And the longer men remain in this system, the more they realize that modern attraction isn't built on bonding first, it's built on maintaining engagement in a world that never stops offering the next hit of attention. There is a misconception that when men disengage, it's loud, that it looks like anger, confrontation, or rejection. But what men are waking up to doesn't announce itself, it retreats. The withdrawal happening now is not dramatic, it's quiet, subtle, almost invisible. Men aren't storming out of relationships, they're simply stepping back before entering them fully. They're delaying emotional investment. They're choosing solitude not because they fear intimacy, but because intimacy has begun to feel asymmetrical. This disillusionment doesn't start with bitterness. It starts with repeated pattern recognition. Men notice that effort is expected early, but appreciation arrives late or not at all. They notice that emotional availability is requested, but often not protected. They notice that responsibility is admired in theory, yet excitement is rewarded in practice. These observations accumulate, each experience alone feels manageable. But over time they form a narrative, and once a narrative solidifies, behavior changes. Men begin questioning whether the emotional cost of participation outweighs the potential reward. Not in a cynical way, but in a rational one. Because men are problem solvers by nature. When a system produces inconsistent outcomes, they reassess input. This reassessment is not announced, it happens internally. Men stop chasing closure, they stop demanding clarity, they stop trying to fix dynamics that feel unstable. Instead, they conserve energy. This conservation is often misread as emotional unavailability, but it's not avoidance, it's adaptation. Men are learning that over-investment in uncertain environments leads to depletion. And depletion doesn't just affect romantic life, it affects confidence, focus, and self-respect. So they begin to detach early, not to punish, but to protect. What's alarming is not the withdrawal itself, but the absence of protest. Historically, dissatisfaction led to negotiation. Now, it leads to silence. Men don't argue about unfairness anymore. They disengage from it. They focus on work because work offers clarity, effort produces results. Progress is measurable. Accountability is defined. They focus on self-mastery because the feedback loop is honest. Discipline creates strength. Consistency creates confidence. There are no mixed signals. And slowly, emotional investment is replaced with self-investment. This shift doesn't come from ideology. It comes from exhaustion. Men grow tired of navigating unspoken expectations, of being emotionally open without emotional safety, of being told to communicate more while being penalized for doing so. They begin to recognize that vulnerability without reciprocity is not connection, it's exposure. And exposure without protection teaches the nervous system to retreat. So men stop offering access to their inner world early. They become selective, reserved, measured. They still desire companionship, they still value intimacy, but they no longer assume that desire alone justifies risk. This silent withdrawal has a ripple effect. Women sense it but often misinterpret it. They see less pursuit, less initiation, less persistence, and they assume men have become lazy, avoidant, or emotionally stunted. But what's actually happening is discernment. Men are no longer willing to earn affection in environments where affection feels conditional, volatile, or fleeting. They are no longer motivated by potential alone. They want predictability, not perfection. The tragedy is that this withdrawal doesn't announce itself as rejection. It simply reduces presence. Fewer conversations deepen. Fewer connections progress. Fewer men volunteer emotional leadership. And the absence is felt long after the moment has passed. What men are waking up to is not a hatred of women, but a loss of faith in the relational structure itself. When a system no longer feels reciprocal, participation becomes optional, and silence becomes the loudest response. Keynote 30: Male Disillusionment and Silent Withdrawal. There is a widespread assumption that when men become disillusioned, it shows up as anger, as resentment, as loud complaints and visible defiance. But what is actually happening now doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like disappearance. Men are not protesting the system. They are opting out of it emotionally. This shift begins quietly, almost imperceptibly. A man still shows up, he still engages, he still listens. But something fundamental has changed beneath the surface. He no longer leads with hope. He no longer assumes goodwill will be returned. He no longer invests deeply before evidence appears. This is not fear, it is memory. Men arrive at this point after repeated experiences where emotional effort was met with uncertainty, where clarity was delayed, where responsibility was expected but reassurance was inconsistent. Over time, these moments don't register as isolated disappointments. They form a psychological pattern. And the male psyche is highly sensitive to patterns. When effort produces unpredictable outcomes, the instinct is not to try harder. It is to reassess participation. Men are wired to allocate energy where it produces results. When relationships begin to feel emotionally volatile, men don't explode. They withdraw allocation. This withdrawal is often mistaken for apathy. But apathy is indifference. What's happening here is calculation. Men are learning that emotional openness without emotional security creates vulnerability without benefit. That communication without mutual accountability leads to exposure rather than understanding. That chasing clarity often results in diminishing self-respect. So they stop chasing. They don't announce boundaries. They simply enforce them internally. They respond slower, they share less. They remain pleasant but distant. The emotional volume is turned down, not because they don't care, but because caring has begun to feel costly. This is where disillusionment truly lives. Not in anger, but in reduced expectation. Men stop assuming that effort will be recognized. They stop believing that patience will naturally be rewarded. They stop interpreting chemistry as commitment. And this fundamentally alters how they engage. The most dangerous part of this shift is that it's invisible. There is no confrontation to respond to, no argument to resolve, no clear moment where something ended. Instead, the connection simply never deepens. Men begin prioritizing environments where rules are clear. Work, fitness, skill building, solitude. These spaces provide something modern dating often does not: predictability. When a man puts in effort at the gym, the body responds. When he commits to a craft, progress is measurable. When he disciplines his routine, results follow. There is no ambiguity. Contrast that with emotional investment that produces mixed signals, shifting expectations, or conditional engagement, and the choice becomes obvious. Men aren't withdrawing because they dislike women. They're withdrawing because uncertainty erodes motivation. They begin to understand that constant emotional negotiation drains focus. That being perpetually evaluated without clear criteria creates anxiety. That offering leadership in relationships without reciprocal stability leads to burnout. So instead of fighting the dynamic, they step back from it. They become selective, not out of arrogance, but out of conservation. They guard their emotional bandwidth. They delay vulnerability. They require consistency before commitment. And this recalibration is often misinterpreted as emotional unavailability. But emotional unavailability implies incapacity. What's happening here is restraint. Men are still capable of depth, still capable of loyalty, still capable of intimacy, but they no longer distribute those qualities freely. They wait, they observe, they verify. The silent withdrawal is not dramatic enough to trend. It doesn't generate headlines. It doesn't spark viral outrage. But it changes everything. It reduces pursuit. It reduces emotional risk-taking. It reduces the number of men willing to initiate, lead, and invest without clear reciprocity. And because it happens quietly, many don't notice until the absence becomes structural. What men are waking up to is that participation is optional when the emotional terms feel unclear, unbalanced, or unstable. And once a man realizes he can preserve his peace by stepping back instead of pushing forward, silence stops feeling like loss and starts feeling like control. Beneath all the conversations about dating behavior and modern dynamics lies a truth most people avoid because it feels uncomfortable to confront. What men are waking up to is not a failure of individuals but a misalignment of incentives that reshapes human behavior at a psychological level. Human beings do not act based on ideals. They act based on reinforcement. What gets rewarded gets repeated. What gets ignored fades. And what creates emotional payoff becomes the preferred strategy regardless of intention or morality. This is where the deeper truth begins. Modern relational dynamics reward independence more than interdependence, visibility more than depth, and choice more than commitment. not because people consciously reject intimacy, but because the environment constantly signals that self-reliance is safer than reliance on others. Men are starting to recognize that relationships are no longer built around mutual necessity. They are built around optional participation, and optional systems function very differently from bonded ones. When people don't need each other to survive emotionally or socially, attachment weakens. Bonds become provisional, connection becomes conditional. The psyche stays alert instead of anchored. Men feel this shift internally. They sense that being needed has been replaced by being preferred, and preference is unstable. Preference changes with mood, novelty, and comparison. Being needed creates responsibility. Being preferred creates replaceability. This realization reshapes male psychology. Men historically derived meaning from being useful, relied upon, and integral. When usefulness is no longer central to connection, identity begins to drift. Men start asking what role they actually play beyond companionship and convenience. This question doesn't produce anger, it produces emptiness, and emptiness seeks structure. Men then redirect their need for meaning into areas that still offer hierarchy, feedback, and purpose, achievement, mastery, creation. These domains reward effort and recognize contribution. Meanwhile, relationships begin to feel less like collaboration and more like negotiation. Negotiation requires leverage, leverage requires detachment, and detachment undermines bonding. This is not because people want power over each other. It's because uncertain environments demand self-protection. The deeper psychological truth is that modern systems prioritize individual optimization over relational stability. Everyone is encouraged to maximize personal outcomes, keep options open, and avoid dependency. But intimacy requires dependency, not weakness but mutual reliance. Without it, relationships float. They exist without roots. Men are waking up to the emotional consequences of this design. They see that freedom without attachment creates isolation. That independence without interdependence leads to loneliness. That choice without commitment erodes trust. And they understand something else as well. Women are not exempt from this system. They are shaped by it too. Modern women are navigating incentives that reward self-focus, visibility, and autonomy. Men are navigating incentives that reward withdrawal, restraint, and self-sufficiency. Both adaptations make sense individually. Together, they create distance. This distance isn't dramatic, it's subtle. It shows up as delayed commitment, guarded communication, and emotional caution. It feels like something missing but difficult to name. Men are waking up to the truth that the issue is not behavior, it's structure. When systems discourage reliance, people stop offering it. When systems reward optionality, people stop anchoring. When systems penalize vulnerability, people stop risking it. And psychology always follows structure. Men are not awakening to cynicism. They are awakening to pattern recognition. They see that restoring depth requires changing incentives, not assigning blame. That rebuilding trust requires safety, not strategy. That intimacy cannot thrive in environments designed for constant comparison. The deeper psychological truth is not about who is right or wrong. It's about what kind of environment produces bonding, and what kind of environment slowly dismantles it. Men are waking up to the cost of pretending those environments are the same. What men are waking up to is not a single realization, but a layered awareness that has been forming quietly over time. An awareness shaped by mismatched expectations, an attention-saturated environment, emotional imbalance, and systems that reward distance more than depth. This awakening is not fueled by resentment. It is fueled by clarity. Men are recognizing that modern dynamics often ask them to invest without guarantees, to remain open without protection, and to commit within structures that no longer consistently support commitment. And when human beings perceive risk without reliability, the psyche adapts. Silence replaces pursuit. Observation replaces assumption. Self-preservation replaces blind hope. This does not mean men have abandoned love, intimacy, or partnership. It means they are no longer willing to sacrifice inner stability for external validation. They are no longer chasing narratives that do not align with lived experience. The alarming truth is not that men are changing. It is that the environment changed first and men are simply responding. And until the incentives that shape connection are examined honestly, this awakening will continue, not loudly, not angrily, but quietly, reshaping relationships from the inside out.